Hello and welcome back. This very brief video is designed to introduce students to the development of anthropological theory. Uh, Now in previous video, we had a somewhat of a kind of a deep dive conversation on ethnographic methodology, which it's just methods, sort of the how-to, right? And anthropology historically has been defined by the how-to. For more than 100 years now, anthropologists have been going into the field and have been using the method of first-hand accounts to be able to record and to produce social documentation. In this particular segment of our class, we're going to be looking at the ideas that we draw from this social documentation. And I'd like to start with, we're looking at, the slides, right? So we're looking at the second slide. I want to start with this very classic ethnographic piece of work called, regarding the Yanomamo of Venezuela. Now, the Yanomamo are a group of people that we think have been in the area for tens of thousands of years in so much as there hasn't been a lot of migration from that group from, outside of the radius of right along the Orinoco River in Venezuela. So if you need to take a look at a map, it'd be a good time to do that. Of course, a quick Google search will solve that problem. However, in the 1970s, word sort of spread through the academic community that there was this sort of untouched, uncontacted, uninterrupted group that was living in this region. And this, of course, is 400 years after colonialism and European contact. And so this group had been essentially uncontacted and represented likely what life may have looked like in the Americas prior to Columbus and the exploration of Europeans onto the continents. And so during the 70s, there was almost like this intellectual academic land grab, right? Many academics wanted to go into the field and contact the Yanomamo and record their life. And the individual that found himself out there first was a researcher by the name of Napoleon Chagnon, or Napoleon Chagnon. And Chagnon finds himself living with the Yanomamo for about 10 years. And one of the things that stands out to him almost within the first year is the use of violence to solve problems. It's a form of systemic conflict resolution. Murders, kidnappings, beatings, all of these things are done as a way to socially regulate people in a group. Now, a lot of what we're going to be looking at today is the concept of social regulation. And so what might be regulating, like let's say you or I, is upon every opportunity that we have to make a decision about something, we may reflect on our own morals or our own values. We may even consider, for example, religious ideology, our upbringing, our communities, right? So we think about where our kind of moral compass is. And what we do with that is we allow that to sort of socially regulate us. It kind of dictates how we behave. In some way, it's socially very controlling. And what Chagnon argues in his writings about the Yanomamo is that morals and values don't seem to be regulating behavior as much as violence does. And if there's a problem that erupts, there are ways of systemically solving those problems by exercising some form of controlled violence. And it's just accepted in passing that every male at some point will either be murdered, right, or will experience murdering another member. He even goes so far as to say that if you're thinking about it from a Darwinist perspective, that for those males that find themselves murdering and violently aggressing other members of their group, that they're more likely to reproduce. And he starts kind of producing data around this idea that those murderers in the group wind up fathering more children, which is a really dangerous way of looking at the world, right? Nevertheless, 1970s, 1980s roll around, and this information is gobbled up by several communities. One of them obviously is a military community, right? It kind of goes to the root of human aggression, human violence, right? It really speaks to our understanding of chimpanzees, for example, and what we know about a chimpanzee hunt or a chimpanzee murder, right? It reinforces this idea of masculinity and aggression and competition. But it also absolutely captivated the American public, right? Because the American public basically ate this text up. It had a lot to do with what the public is often very excited about, which is either sex or violence, and so violence was what was on deck, and people were basically captivated by it. And so I want to use this example, right? I would absolutely love to have a really broad conversation about the real true nature of humans and whether or not this informs us about the true violent nature of human beings, right? At some point right now, you may be thinking to yourself about raising children or having a sibling or knowing a child and recognizing that children often resort to violence. They may punch or scratch or something, maybe even bite, right, to solve their problem, to express, or even to emote. And with all of that, you can also kind of add that to the infrastructure of these arguments that humans are if not predisposed, genetically wired for aggression. So what I'd like to do is I would like to think about Yanomamo violence, and I'd like to try to fit that into 4 very recognizable theories in anthropology. One of them, this is on slide 4 now, is structural functionalism. Now, the theory of structural functionalism is one that argues that every human act that we participate in not only benefits us, it helps us with our own function, but also helps to reinforce the structure of society. And so what I very much like thinking about here is if you think about any funerary custom. So let's say, for example, you live in a community, a member of your community dies, and you're feeling personal grief over this, right? You're grieving hard over the loss of the member of this group. And you've kept that very public and have not shared the grieving experience with other members of your group or your social group. And so the production of a funeral does a number of things here. So you go to a funeral for this person, and on one hand, the funeral reinforces the group. It brings a community of people together. It also demonstrates through public performance what it looks like to grieve as a community. And it also, in another way, rallies people together on the basis of having known this individual. So for the purpose of keeping the structure of society together, if culture really is about finding solutions to human problems, as many will say, well, a funeral, structurally, is a way that humans sort of societally figure out how to grieve together. And at the same time, we know that when we go to a funeral or experience such loss, being in the theater of such a cultural event also allows us to personally grieve. And so the combination of our own individual journey and the reinforcement of our culture is precisely what the structural functionalists argue about every one of our human behaviors and cultural behaviors, excuse me. So we have to think about the wedding, the birthday, the holidays, right? Coming of age rituals, right? When a young girl becomes a woman, a young boy becomes a man, for example. All of these things aid to help the individual, but also reinforce larger ideas about the structure of our society, right? So it's telling almost 2 stories. And so if we look at the structural functionalist explanation for Yanomamo culture, right? One is violence not only serves to reinforce everyone's behavior. So for example, if you want to act in a way that might wind up, you might wind up being punished through a beating or possible murder, you may not actually do that behavior, right? And if you're living among the Yanomamo, what the violence does is regulate your own social behavior. So for example, if you're someone who's watching another person being murdered or watching someone being beaten, that might give you just a little bit more motivation to not do the thing that would get you in trouble, right? And at the same time, for a person who is aggressing towards another person, they might actually have a personal investment in wanting to kill the other individual, right? And so looking at Yanomamo violence from the perspective of structural functionalism, it helps keep the society together. It reinforces social ideas of morals, values, and sort of what are good ideas and what are bad ideas, but it also may be vindicating for the individual as well. It helps that individual basically solve their own issue as well, right? Which takes us to slide 10, and this is the French structuralist camp, or the theories around French structuralism. French structuralism, and where it differs from previous theories that we've talked about in the past, is that the structuralists posit that every human is essentially primed or prepared to learn culture, that we operate with culture. So if you think about a human, let's say, for example, as a brand new phone, and you open the package of the phone, all the hardware is there, and you might sit with the phone and either transfer data or download a bunch of apps. You know that the phone could download and operate those apps. And part of how the French structuralists see humans is in a very similar way, that we have the hardware. We are hardwired for culture. We're hardwired for what are called human cultural universals, right? That we are going to naturally want to seek out a caregiver. We're going to naturally in our lifetimes find a way to create meaning in our lives through culture. And so the structuralists sort of arrive during the 1950s and 60s and argue that there must be something almost genetic inside of us that brings us these things, these cultural attributes that we see around the world, right? The celebration of a birthday, the wedding, the funeral, so on and so forth. So maybe there's no surprise then what the structuralists were arguing about Yanomama violence, which is it is innate, that we all have the innate quality of being a violent individual. And the common structuralist would probably and likely argue that if it isn't murder and violence, it's road rage, right? And where it's not road rage, it's raising your voice, right? And where it's not raising your voice, it's just being upset, right? That we have this tendency to want to expel anger, resentment, spite towards other members that we feel have wronged us. And of course, the most extreme example of this is the Yanomama. So again, this is not necessarily explaining why it is the Yanomama are doing this type of behavior, more than just justifying it through theory of the ideas behind the motivations, right? If we move on to slide 14, what you're going to find is an explanation from the cultural materialists. And during the 70s and then well into the 80s, the materialists began looking at the possibility that because most human conflicts actually come from limited resources or resource acquisition, either through land or oil or access to water or ports or usable land for plants, right? The argument was that humans, in general, find ways to create conflict around resources, and therefore the Yanomamo must also be fighting for a resource as well. And that the shortcomings of Chagnon is that Chagnon didn't quite get in his research what the resource was. Now, converse to that argument, Chagnon and those that are sort of like in line with Chagnon's philosophies around violence argue that the resource that the Yanomama were fighting over was women. And so in this very male-centered, sort of androcentric perspective, he's not only arguing that males are naturally violent, but they're naturally violent because they're essentially trading interests in females like commodities. And so the cultural materialist perspective has a lot to do with our understanding of culture as seen through the cultural materials that we possess, trade, and create meaning from and with, right? Even so far as like what you're seeing right now on your screen, between the plant, maybe the article of clothing, the picture behind me, all of these things speak to some sense of maybe things I've collected as an individual, and that's telling a story about how I see myself, how I see my world, and without doubt, you're doing the same thing as well. The one of the last two pieces that I want to talk about is on slide 21, which is symbolic or interpretive anthropology. And this takes a little bit more of an atmospheric approach to culture. And the argument is that culture is symbolic, it's interpretive. Okay, so I'm literally interpreting that. But the part about the interpretation speaks largely to the researcher interpreting what they're seeing from their perspective. So why this gets a little silly, right, is when we look at, for example, let's say, for example, you and I and 10 other people, we all watch a movie together. We sit down and watch a film, and then after that, we all talk about the film. And we're certain to not talk about the film during the film, but we're talking about it after the film. And we find that all of us have different impressions, interpretations of the film. And ultimately, interestingly, right, we all saw the same thing at the same time, in the same place, but all have different perspectives. Now, if we could do that with a film, we can most certainly do that with a song. And if we can do that with a song, we can do it with a picture. And if we can do it with a picture, we can do it with an article. And if we're doing it with an article, we can do it with a book. And so symbolic and interpretive anthropologists begin arguing that when we take a look at culture, like a movie, is just a text that we read and we interpret. And my interpretation of a culture as a text is nothing different than your interpretation of culture as a text. You and I might go to the same event, witness the same culture, and have two completely different responses. And so the symbolic and interpretive anthropologist might actually turn the attention towards the researcher and say, well, if you saw violence among the Yanomamo, what does that say about you, right? What does that say about your culture? If that's the first thing that you saw, what kinds of things are you ignoring to get to the point where that becomes so center stage in terms of your interpretation of this culture, right? If there's no right answer to culture and it's all about some form of expression, and there's no way to really measure culture by using the scientific method, then it really is just open to interpretation, right? And so that brings us to the final sort of theoretical orientation, which is on slide 27, and that is the development of postmodern anthropology. Postmodern anthropology, or postmodernism in anthropology, and the theories within that, right, largely look at power dynamics and assess the relationship between the researcher and the subject. And it should be noted, maybe, timing's perfect here, right? It should be noted that, anthropologist Napoleon Chagnon, who is an American, goes into the field and he sees violence. And this is what he's creating this whole narrative about Yanomamo violence. And then during the 1980s, a French scholar goes into the Yanomamo territory and he actually doesn't see the same level of violence, but begins writing this massive documentation, cultural information about the sexual practices of the Yanomamo, and describes them as like having these, really detailed masturbatory practices and sexually being free. And so you have like almost during the 1980s, the American and the French perspective here of the Yanomamo, both of which I think we can make a really good argument, speak much more to the researchers and what they're seeing and what they're bringing than it does the Yanomamo themselves. So the postmodern lens, to some end, looks at culture and culture interpretations and forces us to look at the context of the power dynamics between the researcher and the subject, and also asks us to look at the time for which the materials are produced. If we are looking at an ethnographic piece of social documentation, for example, that was written during the colonial era, if it's written obviously by someone who is part of the colonial experience, well, that is certainly going to change or tint or even create a bias from how you and I, for example, read that material and draw our own interpretation, right? So therefore, where postmodernism leaves us with Napoleon Chagnon and the Yanomamo is they may be violent, but the fact that there is a value judgment on the Yanomamo being violent is only because someone was using that particular lens to see the Yanomamo and happened to ignore everything else. I think it's also really important to note that when we read the ethnography about, or something I've assigned you to read about the Yanomamo from Napoleon Chagnon, he uses incredibly suggestive language about the primitive or even barbaric nature of the Yanomamo, and maybe not so much barbaric but primitive nature of the Yanomamo, and talks about them and even likens them to like, you know, fruit flies, and just talks about how difficult it was to live in that environment. And that very much drums up a great deal of word pictures that we can create when we think about the treacherous conditions of people living in the jungle, and to draw on our assessments of, or maybe our theatrics of how early or primitive humans must have lived, right? So on that note, I want to thank you for watching this, and I hope to see you soon. Bye.